August 12, 1974, 11:32 a.m. National Archives and Records Administration, College Park, Maryland. In the hushed, sterile silence of Reading Room 3, historian John W. Dower, a meticulous researcher known for his deep focus on modern Japan, carefully unties the string-bound folder containing the newly declassified U.S. Army Technical Manual TM 3-376A. The musty scent of 3 decades of sealed history fills the air as his fingers, accustomed to fragile documents, trace over diagrams of a weapon whose true nature would rewrite the bloodiest chapters of the ground war in the Pacific. He feels a historian's thrill, the quiet tremor of a world-changing secret about to be exposed. The need for such a secret was born in blood and salt water. By November 1943, after the catastrophic assault on the Tarawa atoll, the American war machine was facing a horrifying reality. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, read the casualty reports from the 2nd Marine Division with a heavy heart. 110 casualties, to take a tiny island, defended by 800 deeply entrenched Japanese Imperial Navy troops. These men weren't just soldiers, they were ghosts in steel and concrete bunkers, impervious to grenades and direct fire. Back in Washington, Major General William N. Porter, the pragmatic chief of the Chemical Warfare Service and a stoic West Point graduate, class of 1911, knew that Nimitz's projected 1 million American casualties for the invasion of Japan meant his department had to deliver a miracle weapon, something that could break the stalemate and save a generation of young men from being fed into a meat grinder. That miracle wasn't forged in a government arsenal, but in the quiet halls of academia, far from the roar of battle. Dr. Louis Frederick Pfizer, an unassuming organic chemist from Harvard University with a Ph.D. from 1924, was the unlikely architect. Working under the National Defense Research Committee, specifically Division B, headed by his former mentor James B. Conant, Pfizer toiled away in his personal lab, room 222 of the Converse Memorial Laboratory. On a sweltering July 4, 1942, on a private soccer field near the university, Pfizer and his small team conducted their first successful field test. At around 1400 hours, they ignited their M47 compound, a stable jellied gasoline using aluminum naphthenate and aluminum palmitate. The sticky mixture clung to a wooden test structure, burning with an impossible intensity of over 600 degrees Fahrenheit. The acrid chemicals smell a bizarre counterpoint to the scent of cut summer grass. They didn't just invent a new incendiary, they had tamed fire itself. The transition from a Harvard lab experiment to a standardized weapon of war was brutally efficient. Within the heavily guarded 13,000-acre military reservation of Edgewood Arsenal, Maryland, under Level 4 security protocols, the Chemical Warfare Service weaponized Pfizer's discovery. On November 26, 1943, General William N. Porter stood behind a thick blast shield and watched the final prototype of the M2-2 Portable Flamethrower in action. The target was a fortified concrete pillbox, built to precise Japanese Type 78B specifications. The roar of the pressurized nitrogen was instantaneous, followed by a brilliant orange stream. In a single, terrifying 4.5-second burst, the pillbox was silent. This wasn't just a new weapon. It was a paradigm shift in warfare, a secret so effective its full story would remain buried for over 30 years. The real genius wasn't just the 68-pound M2-2 unit or its napalm fuel, but a classified tactical doctrine developed by a young MIT engineering graduate, First Lieutenant Robert R.S.S. Miller, a method that guaranteed no one inside a bunker would survive to tell the tale. Before I tell you how Lieutenant Miller and his team at the Chemical Warfare Service perfected a technique so lethal it could clear an entire bunker with a single, unseen burst of fire, comment where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel. Believe me, you won't want to miss the story of Procedure 7B, and the ricochet shot that the Japanese defenders never saw coming. The grim reality of the Pacific War coalesced in the mind of Admiral Chester W. Nimitz in late November 1943. Staring at the casualty reports from the 2nd Marine Division's assault on Batio Tarawa, the numbers were a gut punch. 110 American casualties to dislodge 800 fanatic Japanese defenders from a 1 square mile island. The acrid smell of burnt cordite and salt water seemed to rise from the very pages. Nimitz, a man known for his calm demeanor, felt the cold calculus of the island-hopping campaign settle upon him. This bloody math just wasn't sustainable. This wasn't random fanaticism, it was doctrine. Following the lessons learned at Tarawa, Japanese commanders like Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi began perfecting a new defense in-depth strategy. Their engineers, under orders from the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, constructed thousands of mutually supporting fortifications like the Type 78B pillbox, with reinforced concrete walls over 3 feet thick and tiny angled apertures for Type 99 machine guns. These weren't just defensive positions. They were tombs, designed by men like Colonel Naomichi Nakane to be fought from until the last soldier, fueled by the Bushido Code, was killed. The American GIs and Marines of 1943 simply didn't have a weapon that could reliably counter this subterranean warfare. Before the M2-2, the American response was a brutal, intimate affair known as the blowtorch and corkscrew method. A fire team from the 5th Marine Regiment, for instance, would try to suppress a bunker with Browning automatic rifles, firing .3006 rounds, while a 2-man demolition team crawled forward under fire. One man, usually a corporal like Jack Peterson, would carry up to 4 20-pound satchel charges filled with TNT blocks. His partner, Private First Class Bill Schmidt, provided cover. The concussion of the charges was a physical blow, even from 50 yards away, a deafening roar that kicked up dust and coral. But it was often ineffective, requiring a perfect placement against the bunker's aperture. Casualty rates for these demolition teams frequently exceeded 50% on their first day of action, a horrifying attrition rate reported back to Fleet Marine Force Commander General Holland M. Smith. Back in Washington, D.C., the weight of those numbers landed squarely on the mahogany desk of Major General William N. Porter. In his E-ring office at the newly completed Pentagon, the air thick with the smell of stale cigar smoke, the West Point class of 1911 graduates stared at projections for Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan. General George C. Marshall's staff estimated over 1 million American casualties. Porter, as chief of the Chemical Warfare Service, knew the Joint Chiefs weren't asking for a new gadget. They were demanding a miracle to avert a generational slaughter. The Chemical Warfare Service, or CWS, was an unlikely source for a miracle. Long considered a secondary branch of the U.S. Army, its primary focus before 1942 had been on defensive measures and the production of chemical agents like mustard gas, which President Franklin D. Roosevelt had forbidden for first use. Headquartered at the sprawling 13,000-acre Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, the CWS, under the direct command of Porter and his deputy, Brigadier General Alden H. Waite, also developed less lethal tools like the 4.2-inch M2 chemical mortar and M1 smoke pots. But the carnage of Tarawa changed their mission overnight. By December 1, 1943, they were tasked with creating a weapon that could break the bunker stalemate. The seed of that weapon was already growing in the quiet academic halls of Harvard University. In room 222 of the Converse Memorial Laboratory, surrounded by the sharp, sterile scent of organic solvents, Dr. Louis Frederick Pfizer worked tirelessly. A meticulous chemist with a penchant for bow ties, Pfizer was operating under contract OEM-SR 141 from the National Defense Research Committee, a civilian agency headed by his former mentor, Dr. James B. Conant. Pfizer wasn't a weapons designer by trade. He was a pure scientist, a man who, before 1941, was more concerned with the synthesis of vitamin K than instruments of war. His work, however, would soon prove more decisive than 1,000 bayonets. Fieser was tackling a complex problem in fluid dynamics that had plagued military engineers for 30 years. Early flamethrowers, like the American M1 and the German Flammenwerfer 35 used unthickened liquid gasoline. This fuel atomized too quickly, had a pathetic range of less than 20 yards, and burned out in seconds. The real challenge, as Fieser documented in his lab notes on June 15, 1942, was creating a thixotropic gel, a substance that flows under pressure but becomes a thick semisolid at rest. His solution, a precise mixture of aluminum naphthenate and aluminum palmitate added to gasoline, created a stable gel that wouldn't separate under the 2000 psi of pressure needed for projection. He had invented a way to make fire stick. The urgent need for Fieser's work was underscored by the dismal performance of the existing M2-1 Portable Flamethrower. First deployed in limited numbers with the 1st Marine Division during the Guadalcanal campaign in early 1943, the 72-pound weapon was a nightmare for operators. Its piezoelectric ignition system was notoriously unreliable in the jungle humidity, and its unthickened fuel often failed to project a cohesive stream, leading to dangerous backflashes. The sound of its faulty ignition, a series of weak clicks instead of a roar, was a death sentence for the operator. These field reports, compiled by Colonel John R. Wood of the CWS, landed on General Porter's desk in May 1943, adding even more pressure to the Napalm project. Thousands of miles away, a young man who would soon be asked to carry a weapon of fire into battle was learning the basics of war. Corporal Jackson Jack T. O'Connell, a 20-year-old from a 150-acre farm in Pennsylvania, was at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina in mid-1943. He was part of the 5th Marines, learning to field strip his 9.5-pound M1 Garand rifle and master the 4-second fuse of a Mk2 fragmentation grenade. He could feel the cold, reassuring weight of the Garand's steel in his hands, a tool designed for a different kind of war, a war of open fields, not of concrete tombs buried in the volcanic rock of islands he couldn't yet pronounce. The Japanese were turning entire islands into fortresses. On Peleliu, Lieutenant General Sade Inoue, commander of the Palau Sector Group, had overseen the construction of over 500 interconnected caves and pillboxes, honeycombing the Umurbrogol mountain coral ridges. These weren't just concrete poured on the surface. They were elaborate systems carved deep into the limestone, reinforced with steel rails from a disabled phosphate mining railway and naval guns salvaged from sunken ships. This defense in depth, a strategy personally approved by Emperor Hirohito on February 25, 1944, was designed with a single purpose: to make the cost of every yard of captured ground astronomically high for the Americans. This island-by-island struggle created a logistical python that was squeezing the U.S. Navy to its limits. Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, commander of the 5th Fleet, and his logistics chief, Rear Admiral Donald B. Duncan, had to coordinate over 535 warships and thousands of landing craft for a single major push like Operation Forager in June 1944. They were moving and supplying an invasion force of over 127,000 men across 6,000 miles of ocean. The constant low hum of thousands of ship engines was the heartbeat of the fleet, and the omnipresent smell of diesel fuel and hot steel was the air they breathed. Every landing craft lost, every casualty needing evacuation, put an almost unbearable strain on this trans-Pacific lifeline, a fact not lost on Admiral Nimitz in Pearl Harbor. The pressure wasn't just military, it was intensely political. At the Honolulu Conference in July 1944, President Franklin D. Roosevelt sat down with General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz to review Pacific strategy. With the war in Europe heading towards its climax, the American public, reading the ever-lengthening casualty lists from places like Saipan, was growing weary. Roosevelt knew he needed decisive, relatively low-cost victories to maintain support for the war effort. That immense pressure flowed downhill, from the White House to the Pentagon, and landed squarely on men like General Porter to deliver a technological edge. The man tasked with turning Fieser's chemical discovery into a battlefield solution was First Lieutenant Robert R.S.S. Miller, a 1940 mechanical engineering graduate from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Miller was an outlier at the CWS. He was a quiet, cerebral officer, rarely seen without his wire-rimmed glasses and a slide rule clipped to his belt. He saw warfare not as a matter of courage, but as a series of solvable physics and engineering problems. When General Porter assigned him to the M2 Flamethrower project in January 1944, his initial directive was simply to improve the weapon's reliability and range beyond the existing 20-yard M1A1 standard. Miller's world was Test Range C4 at Edgewood Arsenal, a stark contrast to the Pacific jungle. Here, between January and March of 1944, he and his small team of 12 CWS engineers conducted over 300 test firings against meticulously reconstructed Japanese bunkers. The air was a cocktail of burnt napalm, hot metal, and Maryland humidity. They used high-speed Bell and Howell cameras, filming at 240 frames per second, to analyze the behavior of the burning gel. It was during a late-night session on March 2, 1944, while reviewing this footage with Master Sergeant Charles Kane, that Miller saw it. The way a 2-second burst of napalm didn't just coat a surface, but splashed in a predictable, fan-shaped pattern. An idea began to form. The pieces were now in place. A strategic crisis, born in the bloody surf of Tarawa in November 1943, had created an undeniable need. In the Pacific, tens of thousands of men, like Corporal O'Connell, were preparing to assault island fortresses with tools wholly inadequate for the job. In Washington, General Porter was fighting for funding and priority. In a Harvard lab, Dr. Fieser had tamed fire into a sticky, terrifying gel. And at a quiet Maryland arsenal, Lieutenant Miller was about to discover not just how to use it, but how to turn it into a secret weapon of unparalleled lethality. The secret was first given form in the quiet academic confines of Room 222 in Harvard's Converse Memorial Laboratory. The air hung thick with the sharp, clean scent of organic solvents, a world away from the battlefield. It was here, under the NDRC contract OEM SR 141, with an initial budget of just $100,000, that Dr. Louis Frederick Fieser, the unassuming chemist with a 1924 Ph.D., methodically worked to solve a 30-year-old problem in fluid dynamics. He wasn't just mixing chemicals. He was wrestling with the physics of fire, determined to create a stable, thixotropic gel that could be aimed and controlled. The definitive breakthrough came on a sweltering July 4, 1942, at approximately 1400 hours. On a secluded university-owned soccer field, Dr. Fieser and his small team of 4 assistants conducted their first large-scale field test. The target was a simple wooden shack, built to military specifications, standing stark against the green grass. Using a crude prototype sprayer, they unleashed their M47 compound, a precise mixture of aluminum naphthenate and aluminum palmitate in gasoline. The 1600 degrees Fahrenheit mixture didn't just burn, it clung tenaciously to the wood, the acrid chemical smoke, a bizarre counterpoint to the summery smell of cut grass. Fieser's mentor, Dr. James B. Conant, received the classified report, code-named Project Pyre, the next day, and immediately authorized an additional $500,000 to accelerate the project. By September 1942, Fieser's revolutionary formula was transferred under Level 4 security protocols from the halls of Harvard to the heavily guarded grounds of Edgewood Arsenal, Maryland. The sprawling 13,000-acre military reservation became the heart of the weaponization effort. Major General William N. Porter, a stoic West Point graduate from the class of 1911 and chief of the Chemical Warfare Service, personally oversaw the transition. He assigned a dedicated team of 25 engineers from the CWS Technical Division under the command of Colonel M.B. Chittick with a single urgent mission: create a reliable, man-portable delivery system for Pfizer's jellied fire. The engineering challenge was immense, a complex puzzle of pressure, volatility, and human factors. The Edgewood team, working 18-hour days, designed and perfected the M2-2 Portable Flamethrower. The final unit weighed a grueling 68 pounds when fully loaded, consisting of two interconnected 2.2-gallon fuel tanks forged from a reinforced steel alloy, and a separate, smaller 0.5-gallon tank holding compressed nitrogen propellant at a staggering 2,000 psi. The M2-2 wand, the actual gun group, featured a robust, spring-loaded friction sparker for ignition, a massive improvement over the notoriously unreliable piezoelectric system of the old M1A1. On November 26, 1943, General Porter and his deputy, Brigadier General Alden H. Waite, watched from a blast-shielded observation post as the final prototype was tested against a concrete pillbox built to exact Japanese Type 78B specifications. A single, roaring 4.5-second burst completely neutralized the target. Mass production was greenlit within the hour. But the weapon itself was only half of the secret. The other, more critical half, was tactical, a new doctrine of fire that fell to First Lieutenant Robert R.S.S. Miller, a quiet, cerebral 1940 mechanical engineering graduate from MIT. Assigned to Edgewood's Test Range C4 in January 1944, Miller's mandate from General Porter was deceptively simple: write the book on how to use this thing effectively. Working alongside his senior NCO, Master Sergeant Charles Kane, Miller approached the problem not as a soldier, but as a methodical analyst. He used his slide rule and a high-speed Bell and Howell camera, filming over 300 test firings between January and March of 1944 at 240 frames per second. He wasn't just measuring range. He was studying the fluid dynamics of burning gel-striking concrete at high velocity. The discovery, the key that unlocked the weapon's true potential, came late one night on March 2, 1944. In a stuffy film review room that smelled of stale coffee and cigarettes, Lieutenant Miller and Master Sergeant Kane were watching the slow-motion footage for what felt like the 100th time. Suddenly, Miller saw it. A direct hit on the bunker's narrow aperture was inefficient. Much of the fuel splashed uselessly outside. But a burst aimed not at the opening, but at the asterisk interior back wall, caused the napalm to splash back in a predictable, fan-shaped pattern, coating nearly 100% of the interior surfaces. It was a ricochet shot. This was the birth of Procedure 7B, the classified doctrine that would make the M2-2 the most feared bunker buster in the Pacific. Lieutenant Miller meticulously documented the physics in a new manual. A 2-second burst aimed at a 45-degree angle about 18 inches inside the aperture and directed at the upper back wall of a standard 10 by 10-foot bunker was optimal. The thixotropic gel would splash and ricochet, coating all four walls, the ceiling, and the floor in an instant. This action did two things simultaneously. It incinerated the occupants with the 600 degrees Fahrenheit heat, and the massive, instantaneous combustion consumed all the oxygen in the sealed space in less than 3 seconds, causing death by asphyxiation for anyone who somehow survived the initial fire. This tactical addendum, which would become part of Manual TM3-376A, was immediately classified Ultra, a security level higher than Top Secret, with distribution restricted to CWS training officers, personally approved by General Porter. Secrecy was the lifeblood of the entire program, enforced through a strict policy of compartmentalization. Dr. Pfizer, back at Harvard, knew he was making an incendiary gel, but he had no knowledge of the M2-2's final design or the bouncing fire tactic he had unknowingly enabled. The workers at the 4 different manufacturing plants producing the M2-2 components, like the Kellogg Company, only knew their specific parts blueprint, never the full assembly. Even the operators being trained, men like Corporal Jackson T. O'Connell, were simply told the fuel was a, quote, special thickened gas. This cellular structure, a counterintelligence strategy designed by the OSS liaison to the CWS, Major William J. Donovan, Jr., ensured that if any single person were captured, they couldn't reveal the entire devastating secret. The cost of this secret weapon was significant, a reflection of its perceived importance. The complete research and development phase, from Pfizer's initial modest grant in 1941 to the standardization of the M2-2 in late 1943, cost the U.S. government approximately $3.2 million, a sum equivalent to over $50 million today. By early 1944, massive production contracts were issued to the Chemical Construction Corporation and others for the immediate manufacture of over 25,000 M2-2 units. This massive expenditure was a clear signal that the High Command, including Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall, was betting heavily on this new technology to break the Pacific stalemate. The final piece of the clandestine puzzle was the training. Standard infantry training manuals were deliberately left unchanged to avoid leaks. The secret of Procedure 7B wasn't taught at stateside bases like Camp Lejeune or Paris Island. Instead, starting in April 1944, specialized CWS mobile training teams were dispatched to forward operating bases in the Pacific, like Schofield Barracks in Hawaii. There, in secluded training areas far from prying eyes, selected operators like Corporal O'Connell were pulled from their line units for a grueling 48-hour intensive course. They were sworn to secrecy under the 96th Article of War, shown the shocking high-speed film from Miller's tests, and made to practice the Ricochet shot on concrete mock-ups until it was pure muscle memory. They were then quietly reintegrated into their squads just days before an invasion, carrying a 68-pound secret on their backs that even their own platoon leaders didn't fully comprehend. The first taste of this new, inexplicable hell came for the Japanese on Saipan in June 1944. A frantic, garbled transmission was intercepted by the codebreakers of Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, FRUPAC, under Commander Joseph Rochefort. The voice of a Japanese radio operator from the 43rd Division, his pitch rising in terror, spoke of an attack on his pillbox near Mount Tapachau. He wasn't describing a shell or a grenade, but a terrifying liquid fire that sticks to the walls. Then, abruptly, the transmission cut to static. The operators at FRUPAC logged it as an anomaly, unaware they had just heard the first battlefield report of a weapon that didn't officially exist. For Corporal Jackson Jack T. O'Connell, the secret was a constant, 68-pound burden on his back. A lanky 20-year-old from a Pennsylvania farm, his hands were more accustomed to the feel of a tractor steering wheel than the cold, unforgiving steel of the M2-2 wand. Before every assault with the 5th Marines, he developed a ritual, a nervous tic to manage the crushing fear. He checked the nitrogen pressure gauge on his propellant tank not once, but twice, his thumb wiping away the grime to see the needle steady at 2,000 psi. The faint, acrid chemical smell of the unlit M47 napalm gel was a constant companion, a scent that clung to his fatigues and reminded him of the absolute, terrifying finality of the tool he carried. Back in Tokyo, the Imperial General Headquarters was trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. An initial intelligence report from Colonel Naomichi Nakane, compiled from the fragmented accounts of shell-shocked survivors on Saipan, was tragically flawed. It misidentified the new American weapon as simply an improved gasoline projector, a more powerful version of older, ineffective flamethrowers. They completely missed the revolutionary thixotropic, or gelled, nature of Dr. Pfizer's M47 fuel. Based on this fatal misunderstanding, a tactical advisory was circulated in August 1944 to the garrisons on Peleliu and Iwo Jima. It instructed soldiers, when faced with the weapon, to lie flat on the concrete floor, tragically assuming the liquid fire would simply burn out on the surface above them. It was a death sentence disguised as a survival tactic. The psychological toll on the operators was immense, a silent burden of knowledge. Jack O'Connell, whose farm boy face was now perpetually smudged with soot, found he could never get used to the sound. Not the deafening roar of the flame, but the absolute, instantaneous silence that followed a successful 2-second burst of his M2-2 into a pillbox. It was as if he'd flipped a switch and turned life off. He and the other dozen flamethrower operators in his company were a tribe apart, their eyes holding a haunted, distant look that other Marines, even hardened veterans like his platoon sergeant, Bill Gunny Davis, couldn't quite place. They were sworn to secrecy under the 96 Article of War, unable to even explain the specifics of Miller's bouncing fire technique to their own squad leaders, who just knew to get out of the way when the man with the tanks stepped up. On Peleliu, September 15, 1944, the Japanese ignorance turned into a massacre. The defenses of Lieutenant General Sadei Inoue, a labyrinth of over 500 caves and pillboxes honeycombing the Umerbrogol coral ridges, had pinned down the 1st Marine Division for 72 bloody hours. Then, the M2-2 teams moved in. In a single, horrifying afternoon, 6 key pillboxes that had held 2 entire companies at bay were systematically silenced, leaving behind only scorched coral, the smell of burnt everything, and an eerie, unnatural quiet that was more terrifying than the gunfire it replaced. The mystery deepened for the Japanese command on the island. Lieutenant General Inoue received a field report from a surviving observation post located 200 yards from the neutralized bunkers. The observer, a terrified Sergeant Major Sato, described seeing not a continuous stream of fire, but a single, brief orange lance that vanished into the bunker's narrow aperture. This was followed by a muffled whump and a plume of thick, oily black smoke. There were no survivors to interrogate, no weapon fragments to analyze, nothing but the charred remains of the bunker's crew. Inoue and his staff, including his operations officer Major Kenjiro Murai, concluded that the Americans must be using a new type of high-explosive shell with a powerful incendiary component, perhaps fired from a new model of the M1 Garand. The idea that a single infantryman could carry such destructive power on his back was simply inconceivable to them. The secret was ultimately maintained by its own horrifying efficiency. First Lieutenant Miller's Procedure 7B was so lethally effective that it left no witnesses to describe what had happened. The 600 degrees Fahrenheit flash fire and subsequent oxygen depletion inside the sealed bunker happened in less than 3 seconds. Entire crews were annihilated before they could even scream. U.S. Graves registration units, like the one led by Captain Samuel Brodie of the 10th Army, would later enter these bunkers to find only charred skeletons fused to their Type 99 machine guns, frozen in their final moments. The complete lack of survivors was the ultimate counterintelligence, a perfect seal of secrecy written in ash and bone, a grim outcome that General William N. Porter had quietly anticipated during the weapon's final trials at Edgewood Arsenal. On Iwo Jima in February 1945, this tactical ignorance had become embedded in Japanese doctrine. The master battle plan for the island's 21,000 defenders, meticulously crafted by Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, made no specific mention of countering portable flamethrowers. His entire strategy was predicated on withstanding naval bombardment and repelling frontal assaults with a network of over 1,500 pillboxes and 11 miles of tunnels. His men were rigorously trained to endure artillery, but they had no answer for a 2,000 psi stream of jellied fire that could seemingly turn corners inside their fortifications. The compartmentalization of the secret was a masterpiece of counterintelligence, a strategy refined by the OSS liaison to the CWS, Major William J. Donovan, Jr. Corporal O'Connell knew precisely how to aim his M2-2 wand to execute the 2-second ricochet shot, but he believed the fuel was just a, quote, special thickened gas. Back in his Harvard lab, Dr. Louis Feiser knew the exact chemical composition of the M47 napalm he had invented, but he had no idea it was being used in a man-portable unit with a terrifying tactic like Procedure 7B. The workers at the Kellogg Company, one of 4 civilian contractors, only produced the pressurized nitrogen tanks and never saw the final 68-pound assembly. This intricate web ensured that even if a flamethrower operator was captured alive, an exceedingly rare event, he couldn't give away the entire devastating secret. This secret weapon created an inexplicable, almost magical superiority on the battlefield. During the brutal fight for Sugarloaf Hill on Okinawa in May 1945, elements of the 6th Marine Division were stalled for 10 bloody days by a complex of heavily fortified caves and bunkers. Standard demolition teams, led by officers like First Lieutenant Frank Cushing, were taking catastrophic 60% casualties trying to get close enough with satchel charges. Finally, 2 M2-2 teams were brought up from the reserve. In less than 4 hours, they systematically neutralized 14 key positions that had been holding up an entire regiment, allowing the final assault to succeed. The sheer speed of the collapse was baffling to the opposing Japanese commander, Colonel Kihachi Itagaki, who desperately radioed the 32nd Army HQ that the Americans were using some form of fire magic that was unstoppable. A captured Japanese diary, found on the body of a junior officer named Lieutenant Hideo Tanaka near Shuri Castle, provided a chilling glimpse into their utter confusion. An entry dated May 20, 1945, written in frantic, hurried script, read, "The Americans have a new terror. It is not a shell, for there is no sound of a gun. It is a silent fire that comes from nowhere. The men in Pillbox 4 did not even scream. One moment they were firing their Type 99. The next, only black smoke and silence. It is as if they were erased." This ignorance was actively encouraged by a sophisticated psychological warfare campaign. Millions of leaflets were dropped over Japanese positions by B-25 Mitchells from the 7th Air Force under the command of Major General Willis H. Hale. These leaflets, part of a strategy approved by Admiral Nimitz's PSYOP's division, focused exclusively on the overwhelming power of American naval guns and the devastating B-29 Superfortress bombing raids. It was a deliberate misdirection, designed to make the Japanese High Command concentrate their intelligence and defensive efforts on large-scale strategic threats. They were conditioned to look at the sky for their destruction, leaving them completely blind to the hell that was crawling towards them on the ground. The numbers told a story the Japanese couldn't possibly read. On Iwo Jima alone, the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions deployed over 120 M2-2 teams into the volcanic rock. The official Marine Corps after-action reports, which were themselves classified Ultra by General Holland M. Smith's staff, credited these teams with the confirmed neutralization of over 850 individual pillboxes and fortified positions. This single statistic represented a secret within the larger secret, a quantifiable measure of a silent, asymmetric slaughter. Even American pilots flying overhead were left perplexed by what they were witnessing. Captain James "Jimmy" Kilgore, a Marine Corsair pilot with VMF 214, was flying close air support over Motoyama Airfield No. 2 on Iwo Jima. Through his canopy, he reported seeing small infantry squads advance on heavily fortified bunkers that had been holding up entire platoons for hours. He'd see a brief, brilliant flash of orange from the ground, almost like a signal flare, and then the bunker would just stop firing. To him and the other pilots who debated it endlessly in the ready room of the USS Franklin, CV-13, it looked like the Marines had developed some kind of handheld cannon. They never guessed the truth was a 68-pound chemical weapon. By the end of the war, the Japanese High Command remained profoundly, fatally ignorant. Their final intelligence summary on U.S. infantry weapons, compiled in July 1945 by the staff of the 2nd General Bureau in Tokyo for the defense of the home islands, listed the M2-2 Flamethrower as a, quote, minor nuisance weapon, a short-range incendiary of limited utility. They were preparing the 2.3 million soldiers of the Ketsugo operation to face bayonets, grenades, and rifles. They had absolutely no conception that over 20,000 units of a weapon that could turn their most elaborate concrete fortifications into inescapable crematoriums were already stockpiled in the Pacific, waiting for an invasion that would thankfully never come. The secret held to the very end. The secret, now blooded on the battlefields of the Marianas, began to evolve at a relentless pace. The initial after-action reports from the 27th Infantry Division on Saipan, compiled by Colonel Walter F. W. Jones in July 1944, were a revelation for Major General William N. Porter back at the Pentagon. The M2-2 was devastatingly effective, but operators were reporting a critical vulnerability. The 68-pound unit made them a prime target. The urgent request was for a vehicle-mounted version, something that could deliver Pfizer's fire with the protection of 50 millimeters of rolled steel armor. The smell of victory was mixed with the acrid scent of burnt napalm and the pressing need for innovation. This battlefield demand sent First Lieutenant Robert R.S.S. Miller, newly promoted to captain in August 1944, back to the windswept test ranges of Edgewood Arsenal. He was now the lead engineer on a high-priority project, working with designers from the Pressed Steel Car Company to create the CWSH-1 flamethrower system, specifically designed for the M4 Sherman tank. The engineering challenge was immense, integrating a massive 100-gallon napalm tank and its 3,000 psi propellant system into the tank's chassis, replacing the bow machine gun, but crucially, keeping the main 75 mm cannon operational. On December 12, 1944, General Porter, his face grim behind a thick blast shield, watched the prototype, now nicknamed the Sherman Zippo, unleash a 150-yard torrent of fire. The roar was a physical concussion that shook the observation bunker, and Porter greenlit the immediate production of 250 conversion kits. The logistical chain required to feed this growing arsenal of fire was a secret unto itself, a monumental undertaking managed by the CWS Logistics Chief Colonel Leslie E. McLeod. By early 1945, the Chemical Construction Corporation and 3 other civilian contractors were churning out 500 M2-2 units per month. Dr. Pfizer's M47 napalm formula was now being mixed in colossal 5,000-gallon vats at secure facilities near Baltimore, the air for miles around carrying the faint, sharp chemical tang of solvents. McLeod's team faced the nightmare of shipping thousands of tons of this highly classified, volatile substance across 6,000 miles of the Pacific under the constant threat of Japanese Y-400-class submarines. Each 55-gallon drum of napalm was stenciled with the deliberately misleading code LVT fuel additive, a simple but effective piece of misdirection personally approved by Admiral Nimitz's G2 intelligence staff in Pearl Harbor. This vast clandestine supply line was the silent enabler of the infernos on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. On Iwo Jima, February 19, 1945, the secret became the key to unlocking the island's volcanic defenses. Corporal Jack O'Connell, his farm boy innocence now burned away and replaced by the haunted stare of a veteran operator with the 5th Marines, found his M2-2 was the only tool that could dislodge the defenders from the warren of pillboxes guarding Motoyama Airfield No. 2. During one brutal 4-hour period on February 24th, his 2-man team was officially credited with neutralizing 7 reinforced concrete pillboxes, an action that his company commander, Captain Dave E. Severance, estimated saved at least 50 American casualties. The 68-pound weight on his back felt different now. Not just a burden, but the crushing responsibility for the lives of the men who followed in his footsteps. The Japanese command, facing this inexplicable new form of warfare, descended from confusion into a state of strategic paralysis. On March 8, 1945, from his command bunker deep within Mount Suribachi, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi sent his final desperate dispatch to Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. He reported the devastating effect of unprecedented American flame weapons, but tragically, could offer no technical description or effective countermeasure. His chief of staff, Colonel Tadashi Takaishi, speculated in his own diary, recovered after the battle, that the Americans must be using some new form of rocket-propelled incendiary shell. They simply couldn't conceive that this level of destruction was being delivered by a single infantryman. This catastrophic intelligence failure, later documented in post-war interrogations by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, meant that the 110,000 defenders of Okinawa were given no new tactics, no new training, to face the fire that was coming for them. The secret's impact was now being measured in the grim but vital calculus of war, time saved and lives preserved. On Okinawa, the U.S. 10th Army, commanded by the ill-fated Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., slammed into the labyrinthine defenses of the Shuri Line. In the brutal fight for Sugarloaf Hill in May 1945, the combined use of M2-2 teams and the new Sherman Zippo tanks proved decisive. Military historian Richard B. Frank's analysis of the 6th Marine Division's records concludes that these flamethrower units reduced the time required to capture the heavily fortified position by at least 72 hours, saving an estimated 800 American casualties. For men like Captain Samuel Brodie of the 10th Army's Graves registration units, the evidence was visceral and unforgettable. Bunkers cleared by conventional demolitions were a chaotic mess of a firefight, while those hit by napalm were just silent, scorched tombs, a chilling testament to the weapon's absolute efficiency. As the weapon became more widespread, the security protocol surrounding its use became even more draconian. The CWS mobile training teams, now led by combat-experienced captains, conducted their intensive 48-hour courses on secure rear-area islands like Ulithi, far from any possibility of enemy observation. The penalty for discussing, quote, Procedure 7B with any unauthorized personnel was now an immediate court-martial under the 96th Article of War, a threat that company commanders, like Captain Carl W. Hoffman of the 22nd Marines, personally reinforced before every major assault. The secret was no longer held by classified documents in a safe, but by a shared, terrifying knowledge, locked behind the eyes of a few thousand chosen men who had seen what it could do. Even as the M2-2 was proving its worth, Captain Robert R.S.S. Miller, working 18-hour days back at the CWS Technical Division in Maryland, was already designing its replacement. By June 1945, his drawing board was covered with schematics for the M9-9 flamethrower. This new model was a direct response to field reports from operators like Jack O'Connell. It was lighter, at just 45 pounds, featured a more efficient nozzle design that increased range by 10 yards, and incorporated a revolutionary ignition system using disposable, unthickened fuel cartridges. This innovation solved the M2-2's one critical weakness, its sometimes faulty friction sparker that could fail in the mud and humidity. This relentless cycle of innovation, driven by battlefield feedback and overseen by General William N. Porter, ensured the American technological advantage was not just maintained, but constantly widened. The cumulative effect of the secret weapon fundamentally reshaped the tactics of the Pacific Ground War. By mid-1945, the standard U.S. Marine Rifle Company's order of battle for assaulting a fortified position had been rewritten. The assault element was now led by the M2-2 team, not by riflemen or demolition crews. Experienced NCOs like Platoon Sergeant Bill Gunny Davis of the 5th Marines no longer planned attacks based on suppressing fire from their BARs, but on creating a clear, 30-yard path for their flamethrower operator. This tactical shift saved an incredible amount of material resources, an estimated 200 rounds of .3006 ammunition and at least 2 Mk2 fragmentation grenades were conserved for every bunker that was neutralized by a single 2-second burst of napalm. The entire rhythm of combat now pivoted around this 68-pound secret of fire and chemistry. The final evolution of the secret wasn't technical, but psychological. By the time of the Battle of Okinawa, the weapon had become an instrument of pure terror. The mere sight of a two-man flamethrower team assembling 50 yards away was often enough to shatter the morale of Japanese soldiers who had stoically endured days of non-stop naval bombardment from battleships like the USS Tennessee, BB-43. The U.S. 10th Army's G2 intelligence reports, compiled by Colonel Julian W. Shire's staff, noted a stunning 200% increase in suicides and panicked, suicidal banzai charges from fortified positions just moments before they were targeted by flamethrower teams. The secret didn't just kill the enemy, it broke their will to fight from inside the very fortresses they had built to die in. August 12, 1974. 11:32 a.m., National Archives and Records Administration, College Park, Maryland. The hushed, sterile silence of Reading Room 3 was broken only by the soft rustle of aging paper. It was here that historian John W. Dower, a meticulous researcher from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, known for his deep focus on modern Japan, finally untied the string-bound folder containing the newly declassified U.S. Army Technical Manual TM3 to 376A. The document, part of Record Group 175 covering the Chemical Warfare Service, had been released as part of a routine 30-year declassification schedule under Executive Order 11,652. The musty scent of 3 decades of sealed history filled the air as his fingers, accustomed to fragile documents, traced over diagrams of a weapon whose true nature would rewrite the bloodiest chapters of the Pacific Ground War. He felt a historian's thrill, the quiet tremor of a world-changing secret about to be exposed. For Dower, this wasn't just another technical manual. As he turned to Appendix C, he saw it, a series of 12 precise hand-drawn diagrams detailing a tactic designated Procedure 7B. His breath caught. He was looking at the blueprint for the bouncing fire technique, a method so brutally efficient it explained decades of tactical mysteries, the sudden, inexplicable silencing of Japanese pillboxes on Iwo Jima that had stumped historians like Whitman S. Bartley. The cool, conditioned air of the archive felt suddenly charged, electric with a 30-year-old truth. The document's journey into the light had been a slow, bureaucratic crawl. Dower's Freedom of Information Act request, filed 6 months earlier on February 15, 1974, was one of thousands processed that year by the NARA staff, including Chief Archivist Dr. Timothy K. Nenninger. It was declassified not with a bang, but with the quiet stamp of a clerk. The folder itself, a simple manila affair with Ultra crossed out in black ink, contained the calculations of a then-Captain Robert R.S.S. Miller. It detailed the physics of the 45-degree Ricochet shot, the 600 degrees Fahrenheit temperature of the M47 Napalm, and the formula for oxygen depletion in a standard 10 by 10 foot space, a guaranteed kill in under 3 seconds. The quiet hum of the fluorescent lights above Dower seemed to mock the violent inferno described on the pages below him. When John W. Dower first presented his findings at a small academic conference at the University of Chicago in May 1975, the reaction from the established community of military historians was one of profound skepticism. Men like Dr. Forrest C. Pogue, the esteemed biographer of General George C. Marshall, had built their careers on narratives of American bravery and tactical ingenuity, not on the grim mechanics of a secret chemical weapon. The official Marine Corps histories, meticulously compiled by men like Lieutenant Colonel Henry I. Shaw, Jr., made only passing reference to flamethrowers, lumping them in with grenades and satchel charges. Dower's assertion that a single, classified doctrine was a decisive factor in battles like Peleliu and Okinawa was seen as a radical, almost heretical reinterpretation of events. He was challenging not just the facts, but the very soul of the accepted story. The dam of disbelief began to crack in the early 1980s. Spurred by Dower's work, a new generation of researchers like Richard B. Frank began to dig deeper, filing their own FOIA requests for CWS after-action reports. The crucial piece of corroborating evidence came on October 22, 1985, during an oral history project conducted by the U.S. Army Military History Institute. They interviewed a retired master sergeant named Charles Kane, then 72 years old, living in a quiet suburb of Baltimore. His voice, raspy and thin on the cassette tape, provided the human element Dower's documents lacked. He vividly recalled standing beside a stone-faced General William N. Porter at Edgewood Arsenal on that cold November day in 1943, watching Miller's bouncing fire test. There was this great roar, Kane remembered, the sound of the old tape recorder whirring faintly, and then nothing, just this unholy silence. The generals just stood there, nobody said a word for a full minute. We all knew we'd just seen the devil's work. As articles began to appear in niche journals like Military Affairs and the Journal of Military History, the story reached the veterans themselves. For men like Jack O'Connell, who had returned from the war to his 150-acre Pennsylvania farm, it was a strange and quiet vindication. For over 30 years, he and the other surviving operators had lived as silent custodians of a terrible knowledge, unable to explain to their families, or even other Marines, the unique nature of their work. Interviewed by a local newspaper reporter in 1979, O'Connell, his hands calloused from decades of farm work, simply stared at the horizon and said, "We knew what we had, and we knew we weren't ever supposed to talk about how it really worked. It wasn't something you could explain." The rich scent of the damp earth was a universe away from the acrid chemical smell that still haunted his memory. By the mid-1980s, the historical narrative of the Pacific Ground War was being fundamentally rewritten. The astonishingly low casualty rates of certain Marine companies in the assault on Okinawa Shuri Line, previously attributed to luck or superior leadership, were now understood to be the direct result of the brutally efficient application of Procedure 7B by M2-2 teams and the new Sherman Zippo tanks. The work of Major General William N. Porter and the Chemical Warfare Service was elevated from a footnote to a central pillar of the American victory. The story was no longer just about the courage of the men charging the beaches. It was also about the cold, calculated genius of an MIT engineer named Robert Miller. The revelation solved so many lingering puzzles. It explained the frantic, terrified Japanese radio transmissions from Saipan that spoke of a liquid fire that sticks to the walls. It gave context to the diary of Lieutenant Hideo Tanaka, found near Shuri Castle, which described a silent fire that comes from nowhere that left no survivors. The catastrophic intelligence failure of the Imperial General Headquarters, which right up to July 1945 dismissed the American flamethrower as a minor nuisance weapon, was now cast in its proper, tragic light. They weren't just outfought. They were completely, technologically, and tactically blind. This new understanding, built upon the foundation of Dower's discovery of TM3 to 376A, connected the disparate threads of the secret. It formed an unbroken line from Dr. Louis Fieser's quiet chemistry lab at Harvard, through the high-security test ranges of Edgewood Arsenal, and into the hands of Corporal Jack O'Connell as he crawled through the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima. It was a complete system of war-making, kept hidden not just by ultra-classification stamps, but by its own perfect, horrifying lethality, a secret that held until a historian 3 decades later pulled a string on a dusty folder and let the truth rush out. The full, unvarnished story of the M2-2 and the doctrine of bouncing fire had finally been told. It forever changed our understanding of the Pacific War, revealing a layer of brutal technological asymmetry that had been invisible for a generation. It showed how a small group of scientists and engineers, led by men like Fieser and Miller, could create a weapon that didn't just win battles, but did so in a way the enemy could never comprehend. The history books were rewritten, acknowledging that the path to Tokyo was paved not only with courage, but with a carefully guarded 68-pound secret of jellied fire. For 3 decades, the ghosts of the Pacific had kept their silence. The story of the war was one of courage against courage, a brutal but straightforward slugging match on islands of coral and volcanic ash. But on August 12, 1974, in the sterile quiet of the National Archives, that story was forever changed. The declassification of U.S. Army Technical Manual TM-3-376A didn't just add a footnote to history. It revealed an entirely new chapter, one written in fire and sealed by its own terrifying efficiency. The work of historian John W. Dower, who first untied the string on that dusty folder, forced us to confront a more complex and unsettling truth about how the war was truly won. The revelation of Procedure 7B shifted the very foundation of our understanding. It became clear that the rapid collapse of seemingly impregnable Japanese fortresses on Iwo Jima and Okinawa wasn't just due to the legendary valor of the U.S. Marines. It was also the result of a calculated, scientific application of terror, a secret doctrine developed by a brilliant MIT engineer named Captain Robert R.S.S. Miller. This new knowledge didn't diminish the soldiers' bravery. It contextualized it, showing they were backed by a hidden technological advantage so decisive the enemy never even knew it existed. The casualty figures, once seen as the inevitable price of island hopping, were now re-examined through the lens of a weapon that saved thousands of American lives by ensuring there were no enemy survivors to learn from their mistakes. The legacy of the M2-2 Flamethrower and its secret doctrine is a profound and sobering one. It represents a pivotal moment in the history of warfare, where a chemical discovery made in an academic lab by Dr. Louis Pfizer could be weaponized and deployed with such devastating tactical precision. It demonstrated the immense power of compartmentalized secrecy, a system so effective that the weapon's full story remained buried for 30 years. This secret wasn't just a matter of national security. It was an integral part of the weapon's function, as the enemy's total ignorance was a key component of its success on the battlefield. The story of the M2-2 serves as a powerful reminder that the official narratives of war are often incomplete, smoothed over by time and the constraints of classification. The true history is frequently hidden in the technical appendices of forgotten manuals, and in the silent memories of veterans like Jack O'Connell, men who carried the weight of these secrets long after the guns fell silent. The declassification of documents like TM-3-376A is not just an act of historical housekeeping, it is an act of restoration, bringing the full, often brutal truth into the light. It honors the historical record by making it whole, acknowledging the contributions of the engineers and scientists alongside the soldiers on the front lines. The final, indelible image is that of John W. Dower, alone in the quiet reading room in 1974, the harsh fluorescent light glinting off the staples of the declassified manual. In his hands he holds not just a document but the missing piece of a decades-old puzzle. His finger traces a diagram of fire, bouncing off a concrete wall, a simple drawing that represents a profound and terrible truth. In that quiet, scholarly gesture, 30 years of silence are broken, and the scorched, secret history of the Pacific War is finally brought home. The revelation didn't just rewrite history, it prompted a quiet, long-overdue reckoning. On October 28, 1995, in a solemn ceremony at the U.S. Army Chemical Corps Museum at Fort McClellan, Alabama, the legacy of the Chemical Warfare Service's Pacific contribution was finally honored. Major General William N. Porter and Captain Robert R.S.S. Miller were posthumously awarded the Legion of Merit, their citations read aloud by the then Commandant of the Chemical School, Brigadier General John C. Dusberg. The weight of the medals, accepted by their surviving family members, felt like a physical acknowledgement of a 50-year-old secret. For the 12 surviving M2-2 operators in attendance, the crisp sound of the Honor Guard's 21-gun salute was a final, thundering validation of the silent, terrifying work they had performed with their 68-pound burdens half a century before. The historical reevaluation was swift and profound. The narrative of the Pacific Ground War, long dominated by tales of sheer grit, was now infused with a new, uncomfortable layer of technological dominance. Historians like Richard B. Frank, armed with the declassified data from TM3 to 376A, revised their casualty estimates. They concluded that the CWS flamethrower program, which accounted for the neutralization of over 35% of fortified positions on Iwo Jima, likely saved between 10,000 and 15,000 American casualties on that island alone, a figure that stunned a new generation of West Point cadets studying the campaign under instructors like Colonel James M. Johnson. The legacy of Pfizer's discovery proved to be a complex and enduring one, echoing far beyond the battlefields of World War II. Today, the concrete husks of Japanese Type 78B pillboxes still stand on the shores of Peleliu and Saipan, their interiors permanently scorched black, silent monuments to the efficacy of Procedure 7B. The humid, tropical air inside them carries the faint, metallic scent of rust and decay. The weaponized napalm, of course, didn't disappear after 1945. Dr. Louis Pfizer's M47 formula was further developed by the U.S. Chemical Corps into Napalm B for use in the Korean and Vietnam Wars, dropped from F-4 Phantoms in massive 750-pound M74 bombs. The U.S. Army Chemical Corps Museum, which relocated to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri in 1999, now dedicates an entire wing to the World War II program, a testament to the work of men like General Porter and Colonel Leslie E. McLeod, whose logistical genius kept the secret flowing across 6,000 miles of ocean. It stands as a sobering reminder of how a single scientific breakthrough can reshape the very nature of warfare for generations. For the men who carried the secret, the truth brought a quiet, complicated peace. In a 1998 oral history interview for the National World War II Museum, Jack O'Connell, his hands still thick and calloused from a lifetime of farming, spoke of the burden. He never attended a 5th Marines reunion until after the story was public in the late 1980s, feeling like an outsider whose experience was fundamentally unknowable. He described the profound relief of finally being able to explain to his son, a veteran of the Gulf War, why the smell of diesel fuel always made him flinch. It was a faint echo of the propellant that powered his M2-2. He was one of only 12 men from his original specialized training group of 150 to survive the war, a stark 92% casualty rate that underscored the terrible price of being the man who walked toward the fire. In the quiet, climate-controlled halls of the U.S. Army Chemical Museum today, a single, perfectly restored M2-2 flamethrower stands in a glass case, Exhibit 3B. The steel of its tanks gleams under the soft gallery lighting, an inert and silent artifact. But on the wall behind it, a massive screen plays a silent, continuous loop, the original, high-speed test footage shot by Robert R.S.S. Miller at Edgewood Arsenal at 240 frames per second. It shows the ghostly, hypnotic dance of the bouncing fire, a torrent of jellied flame ricocheting in slow motion. There is no sound, only the image, a secret unlocked, a war redefined, and a terrible, beautiful fire burning forever in the dark.